thank you. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful day. It sort of begs us all outside, but here we are. We don't get a lot of those here. I'm Phil Rosenthal. I'm with the Chicago Tribune. I write a business column. I'm with Kevin Cullen and Shelley Murphy of the Boston Globe, who are here not to do scouting on the Chicago Blackhawks.
Oh, that's not what I said.
but to talk about their new book on Whitey Bulger, who's the Boston mobster caught on the lam after, 16 years? And first of all, let's get the bona fides out. You guys have been Boston journalists for quite a long time at this point.
Well, somebody said between us, it's sort of like, 60 years? Some terrible amount. Yeah, we've been chasing him, combined total of probably 25. I mean, 25 each, so like 50 years between us.
Wow. And although at this point in journalism, having a job is its own reward, you've got an armful of trophies along the way, a Pulitzer Prize, a couple of Polk Awards between you. It's an impressive list. It's a wonderful book. The thing I was reminded of at the very beginning of it, something when I was a kid, my father was taking a friend of mine to go see Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and as he dropped us off, he said, remember, whatever the movie makes of them, they are the bad guys. And the other thing that it reminded me of was the old line from Mel Brooks in The 2,000-Year-Old Man, where he's asked about Robin Hood, and he said, Carl Reiner asked him, he says, what about Robin Hood? He stole from the rich and gave to the poor. He says, nonsense. He stole from everybody and kept everything. And Reiner says, well, how did that happen? And he goes, well, he had a guy named Marty the press agent. Marty would go out and tell everyone, he got from the rich, he gave from the poor. Who knew? He hit you so hard over the head, you didn't know what had happened. And I was thinking about when reading the Whitey Bulger story and stories about pretty much every mobster these days. There is this myth. And I don't know whether it's that we want to believe the myth or whether they want us to believe the myth. They all seem to have myths. Tell us a little bit about the myth of Whitey Bulger and where it starts to sort of come apart when flushed against reality.
Shelley and I sat down to do the book. One of the things, we're trying to look for several narrative arcs. And one of them was the myth-making of Whitey Bulger. So Whitey Bulger, from a very early age, when he was a young teenage criminal, he lived in the housing project, the first one built in New England. And he had a car when no one else had a car. And when he wasn't driving around with his buxom girlfriend, Jackie McAuliffe, he would be out scouting. And he wasn't scouting for criminal opportunities. He was looking for old ladies. And so when he'd see some old lady trundling down with the groceries, he'd pull over, jump out, swing open the door, take the groceries off them, put them in the back seat, drive the old ladies home. That was a very conscious decision. And when everybody, they call it stoop talking in the projects. People would stand out in the stoop and just trade gossip and stories and everything. And every once in a while, somebody would say, "That Jimmy Bulger, he's a hoodlum." And all the old ladies, "Well, now wait a minute. Jimmy's a lovely young man. He gave me a ride home from the market the other day." And he was so conscious of doing that. And he did it right through. And he was the one. The difference about Bulger is it wasn't just his narrative that he was pushing out there. He had a very influential family, and particularly his younger brother, Bill, who became his advocate, particularly when Whitey went to prison. And Bill Bulger was out there propagating the myth, too. Bill Bulger said to my face on several occasions, "My brother would never touch drugs." And Jimmy Bulger, Whitey Bulger, is very good at sophistry. So he'll tell you he was never an informant because he never testified against anybody and put them in prison. Whereas we found his informant file of 700 pages, he very much was an informant. He would tell you that he like this as a criminal, that he had all these scruples and he never touched drugs. In fact, we have a scene he's in the car with drugs, but the reality is he made millions and millions of dollars by shaking down drug dealers and letting drugs go through the neighborhood of South Boston. I lived there in the 80s and the 90s. There was more drugs per capita in South Boston than any neighborhood in the city. And Whitey's got that on his hands.
And you mentioned Billy Bulger, his younger brother, and Billy, who would end up becoming president of the Massachusetts Senate, president of the University of Massachusetts. Even when he was in the state house. He was succeeded by, the future mayor of Boston, Ray Flynn. So, I mean, we're not talking just a quiet power broker. This was a guy who was out there and up there and important. They both came out of this family. The father had been injured lost an arm. But more importantly, where those projects were, South Boston. Tell us a little bit.
Well, I mean, South Boston, is a neighborhood where there was a real Irish ethos. Even though there were many different ethnic groups that lived there, the neighborhood really identified itself as Irish. And even in the public schools, the Albanian kids were forced to sing Irish songs. So, I mean, it's a neighborhood where loyalty meant everything, loyalty to family, loyalty to neighborhood. There was a lot of pride in the neighborhood. And, it's interesting, Billy Bulger, who, as you said, Phil, was probably the most powerful politician in the state for many years. He describes growing up in South Boston in very sort of idealistic terms about how close-knit it was. And, all of even though nobody had very much and they were fairly poor, that they were, the kids hanging together outside, playing games, kick the can, football, whatever. But so there was a lot of, it was sort of not unusual for one family to have someone who would be a priest or a politician or a police officer and another who would be a gangster. It was not all that unusual in that city at that time. One of Whitey's closest associates, Kevin Weeks, also grew up in the projects, and two of his brothers went to Harvard University, and yet Kevin could have gone there. He was so brilliant, but his father was prouder of Kevin for working his way into the position of Whitey's top enforcer than he was of the two that went to Harvard. So there was this sort of culture about the place, and loyalty did mean everything. And that takes us to how this story really starts, with Whitey being cultivated as an FBI informant. It is an FBI agent who grew up in the projects with the Bulger family who recruits Whitey to be an FBI informant.
That agent, John Connolly. The thing that was interesting, and there are so many interesting aspects about the Bulger story, whether it's even the stuff where he's part of that CIA research project with when he's in prison, and who knows what the lasting effects of giving him LSD was.
You'll hear it during his trial, believe me.
Yeah, but the really striking thing is this intertwined corruption of the mob and the FBI, if you can separate them in this case. So they thought. Well, first of all, I should ask you: did they think they were making an informant out of him, or was this simply a bad idea, corrupt at its core?
One of the things, Shelley and I talked about this while we were planning the book out. Could this have happened in any other city? And my belief is no, because there is no other city, whether you're talking about New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Cleveland, L.A., Atlanta. There's no city where you have these two strands of organized crime. One's Irish and one is Italian. In all those other cities, the mafia is by far bigger, more powerful, more lucrative. In Boston, it wasn't that way. So one of the things we tried to show is this all went square, or all went pear-shaped in the 60s, when Bobby Kennedy went to J. Edgar Hoover and said, you need to get serious. Now, at this point, Hoover didn't even accept there was a mafia. And he was ordered by the Attorney General, you have to develop a strategy. And so they decided to go after the mafia, but it really didn't pick up until the 70s. And like I said, that's a national policy. The problem with national policies is they don't take into account regional differences. And in Boston, that model did not fit. But so you had, basically the FBI agents were told, do whatever you have to do to make our policy work. So in the 1960s, what they did is they played God. They decided who would be killed. There was an Irish gang war in the 60s, and more than 60 men were killed in it. And Whitey was very lucky because he was locked up at the time. So statistically, there would have been a very high chance he would have been a perpetrator or a victim of that violence. Instead, he comes out to a decimated landscape. It's wide open for anybody with opportunity and some smarts and some viciousness, and he had all of those things. And so he goes in there, and now Conley's very cynical. Conley's from the hood, and he's saying, and the other thing about the FBI, you get promotions, you get salary raises based on your ability not to make cases, but to turn informants. And so you want to have as many credible informants in your file. It's a notch in your belt. You want to get a top echelon informant. So when John Conley recruits Whitey Bulger in 1975, he gets to say this guy is the